By 1965, the Beatles were changing. Gone were the days of teenage love songs and matching suits. They were growing older, stranger, and bolder. Each new record sounded less like pop and more like a reflection of the world around them. At the heart of that transformation stood John Lennon, searching for a new kind of voice, one that could say something true. And one song in particular became the turning point. When Paul McCartney first heard it, he smiled and said, "That was John doing a Dylan." The song was "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away."
Hey, you've got to hide your love away.
By early 1965, the Beatles had already changed the sound of pop. But John Lennon wasn't satisfied. The fame, the screaming crowds, the constant travel, it had all started to feel hollow. In private, Lennon was listening to someone who seemed to be writing from a completely different place: Bob Dylan. Dylan's songs weren't about love, they were about the human condition. They were rough, poetic, and unapologetically honest. Lennon later said, "Dylan helped me find myself. I didn't want to write pop songs anymore. I wanted to write what I felt." That realization hit him hard, and when he picked up his acoustic guitar one night at his Weybridge home, something new came out, raw, melancholy, and stripped of pretense. "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" was born out of Lennon's growing sense of isolation. Despite global fame, he felt emotionally trapped, confined by image, by marriage, and by the endless circus of Beatlemania. He wrote it in his sunroom, surrounded by the quiet of suburban life that felt almost unreal to him. The song came quickly, like a confession. "Here I stand, head in hand, turn my face to the wall." It wasn't written for anyone else. It was Lennon talking to himself, about pain he couldn't express publicly, about the distance between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. When he played it for Paul, the reaction was immediate. Paul later said, "It was very John, but it was John doing a Dylan. The phrasing, the tone, even the way he sang it." When the Beatles arrived at Abbey Road to record it in February 1965, something was different. There were no electric guitars, no pounding drums, just Lennon with an acoustic, Paul and George on rhythm, and Ringo gently keeping time on tambourine and maracas. Producer George Martin suggested adding a flute section to give it a wistful, almost pastoral feel. John agreed. It was the first time the Beatles had used woodwind on a track, a quiet innovation that gave the song its haunting character. The final take captured something rare: restraint. No harmonies, no studio tricks, just vulnerability. Martin later said, "It was one of John's most human performances. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, he was simply telling the truth." Fans have debated for decades what "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" was truly about. Some thought it was Lennon's coded reflection on his own struggles with identity and fame. Others believed it was empathy, written for Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager, who was secretly gay in an era when that was dangerous to admit. Lennon never confirmed it. He simply said, "It's about the kind of love you can't show. We all have that." That ambiguity became part of the song's strength. It wasn't about one person. It was about everyone who's ever had to hide what they feel. And in that, Lennon had done exactly what Dylan had taught him to do: make the personal universal. Paul McCartney, always analytical about songwriting, immediately recognized the shift in Lennon's writing. It wasn't clever wordplay or catchy hooks. It was honest. And that honesty, he believed, came from Dylan's influence. "You could hear it," Paul said. "The phrasing, the tone, the depth. It was John's voice, but with Dylan's spirit." That was when John stopped writing for the charts and started writing for himself. For Paul, "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" was a milestone. It was the song that showed Lennon's heart, stripped of the pop veneer, raw and uncertain. He later admitted, "That's one of my favorites of John's. It felt real. You could tell he meant it." George Martin saw "You've Got to Hide Your Love Away" as more than an experiment. He saw it as a statement. The Beatles weren't just following trends, they were leading them. And Lennon's vulnerability was proof that rock music could hold emotion as deeply as poetry. Up until then, Martin said, their songs were full of optimism, but this one, This one had pain, real pain, and that made it extraordinary. That honesty would soon define the Beatles' next era, from Rubber Soul to Revolver, from innocence to introspection. And it began here, with Lennon alone and unguarded. When the song was released on Help, in 1965, most listeners didn't realize how important it was. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't revolutionary in sound, but it was revolutionary in spirit. It marked the moment Lennon stopped being a pop idol and became a writer. He'd taken Dylan's freedom, that fearless self-expression, and turned it inward. It was Dylan-inspired, yes, but filtered through Lennon's own voice, wit, and vulnerability. Years later, when asked about the song, John smiled and said, "That was me trying to be Dylan, but it came out me anyway." And that perhaps was his genius. He could borrow another artist's flame, but somehow his own light always burned brighter. You've Got to Hide Your Love Away wasn't the biggest hit the Beatles ever recorded, but it was one of the most important. It was the sound of Lennon changing, finding himself between the shadows of fame and the silence of truth. It was where poetry met melody, where influence became evolution. Paul was right. It was John doing a Dylan. But in the end, it was Lennon doing something far greater, becoming himself.